Hi, everyone.
Greetings. We are in Genesis 9, 1-7, the NIV.
Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from every man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man, shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it.
Changes. The big one is that although the command remains to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, we have now a new accommodation to new situation or new environment, you might say, since the flood.
Yeah.
And now that man must have animal life to sustain him.
Yeah. So this is something new. Your permission is given to eat animals, whereas before it says that he'd given him all the green plants as food.
So it's not natural for man to be a predator. And this new permission, of course, makes it possible for Nimrod the mighty hunter, etc., and for us to be predators and abuse nature. But that's obviously not the intention, because the stress is still upon our being made in God's image, and therefore our dominion should not become domination of the planet.
There's still an accountability attached to what you're doing with animals. So we were initially in the garden. He's given the command that he's to be like caretaker, or what do you call it, when you're responsible for all the lives. Stewardship, right. So now he's still being told that although I'm giving you this for food, you're supposed to show respect for life.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, he's given this restriction of not eating the blood. Show some respect for the life that's being given up in order for you to be sustained.
Of course, God is making a concession that has a risk built in. The risk is that man will become dominating as opposed to just having dominion or kingship.
Yeah.
Stewardship.
Casual about life.
And so when the sacrificial system develops more fully in the law of Moses, you realize all of these things are signals that life is sacred. And everything in the sacrificial system, the prohibition upon the abuse of the blood principle becomes more emphatic.
Even the animals are given a kind of concession too, in that it says that he's put in them a kind of fear and dread of man.
Yeah.
So there's a fighting chance there for them, when it comes to being preyed upon.
And of course, the blood prohibition extends to there's still no permission for human life being taken except on the circumstance that a man takes a life.
Right.
So the sacredness of human life in particular, and the separation of man from all the other creatures, is emphasized by that.
Yeah.
And we think of the fact that before the flood, Cain was apparently forgiven by God. He was even marked or protected by God. And now there's this prohibition. So again, God is making concessions to new circumstances and to our limited lifespan and the new environment.
And then verse 7 shows you that his purpose is not changed. He repeats that first command, have children, fill the earth. That's still his desire for man.
It's never been rescinded. I know Leupold and Morgan have something to say about these changes.
Okay. So Leupold says, Luther rightly dwells on the fact that all these words of God bring encouragement to man in one way or another. For after the flood, the great grief of the survivors at the sad lot of their contemporaries tended to weigh too heavily on their souls. That man might now have assurance of success in his enterprise, and so work joyfully. God speaks kindly encouragement.
Yeah, these are encouraging words. This sadness that we wouldn't even think of, that the whole human race is gone, except for one family.
Yeah.
Campbell Morgan says the first note of change is found in the word which declared man's new relation to the lower orders. In Eden, he had governed by love and his own inherent kingliness. Through the loss of that kingliness resulting from the fall, he had lost his true power of dominion. And now that dominion must be exercised by a fear and dread of him, directly implanted by God in all the lower orders over which man must rule. So I think again of Paul's comment about the groaning of all creation.
Yeah.
Man's lot is harder now that the earth does not bring forth plentifully as it did before, and the animal's lot is harder. But one day that groaning will be over, we are told. There's also a point to be made about the connection with what some consider to be a higher spirituality. I think you remember that in Charles Russell's day, at least, there was a trend among American Christians to think that asceticism and not just abstaining from sex, but abstaining from meats.
Right. So I found that out when I was reading bios of the Alcotts and their connection with Emerson and then others too of that period of time. You see that this was a common practice, that somehow this made you, this was an endeavor to make you a higher person spiritually if you refrained from sex and you didn't eat meat.
And the connection that's made by many commentators upon the direct influence of occultism here, in that traditionally occultists, those who are really into the occult, make the point that the connection with the spirit world is limited, if not non-existent, if you do not abstain from meats. And so that abstention from sex goes along with that your flesh cannot be allowed to disturb you when you're trying to contact the spirit world. So would we think of that? And Hinduism, of course, which forbids.
Yeah. But I think it doesn't even just end with Russell, because Rutherford kind of carried it on in a different way by saying, when he wrote that book, Children, you know, although he didn't forbid sex, he's more or less saying, don't have children. You're a higher spiritual person if you put pioneering first. And I mean, we still heard that.
We heard it.
When we were witnesses, that, you know, you were to forego that in order to be a more spiritual, theocratic person. We
had our version of it then.
Yeah.
I think Leupold has something to say to the abuse of this this permission that we have.
Naturally, this provision would rule out all such cruel practices as those of the Abyssinians? Abyssinians, who gouge out portions of meat from the shanks of living animals, fill up the cavity with dung, and then eat the warm, bloody blood meat. Oh,
it's not just the Abyssinians. This was common practice among the Romans.
Yeah, that's gross.
So all of these things become possible once you give permission. But they would have been possible anyway for debased humanity.
That's so
to get involved in this kind of abuse. And Barnhouse, he has something to say about the occult connection of abstention. I'm thinking of the text in Paul, Timothy, where he says that in the last days men will forbid to marry and to partake of foods which God has given permission for us to eat with thanksgiving. Barnhouse connects it too.
The sacredness of life taught here is not to be carried to the satanic extreme of Hinduism, for God wants man to see death in animals and to live by feeding upon death, as a constant reminder that we live and move and have our being through his death. So that makes me think of the fact that the whole world is kind of a reminder of things and sacramental in its forms. I remember, and I think I've said this before about Victor talking about, every time you sit down to a meal, it should be a reminder that something died for you to live, and that should remind you of Christ.
And if we live close to the land, we would see that the connection between death and our sustenance. We'd see it all the time, but living as we do in urban landscapes,
and it should make you more respectful of life and grateful and thankful for provision made for you.
So the agrarian lifestyle of the Israelites, along with the sacrificial system, would have kept that connection between life and blood before you all the time.
Right.
So what were our links? Ray France?
Ray France had one called J.W.'s Urged to Look Normal. So that was to do with
the book Children?
About not having children,
Mm-hmm.
Postponing it. And the second link was one that I did with Lewis, talking about playing God in our attitudes about sex and marriage.
What's
what was
the first commandment?
First command, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So those two links are on your screen.
Mm-hmm.